Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. So, how's everyone's Ignite going so far? Oh, come on, we can make a bit more noise than that. Come on, how's everyone's Ignite, yeah? Yeah, that's better. That's better. That's what we want to hear. Okay, so welcome to our session called Being DBA is Cool Again with SQL Server 2016. Our code for this session is DAT335. So if you are actually going to socialize any thoughts about things you hear and that throughout this session, like, use the hashtag of DAT335, that'd be appreciated. We're going to, go and look up that sort of stuff afterwards. So, so what we're going to look at today is, a couple of the key features that really should be exciting DBAs around the tool set that we actually get with SQL Server 2016. So, my name's Matt Lavery. I'm a Premier Field Engineer with Microsoft based here in Queensland. And I've been with the company now about 4 years. And prior to that, I've worked for a number of other organisations in Queensland, but altogether about that 14-year experience with SQL Server. So I've certainly seen the product come through a number of different evolutions and around the tool set and even the back-end engine. But certainly the features we're going to look at today are the ones that really have me excited about the next release of the tool set for 2016. And I hope you guys really leave today with that same level of enthusiasm about what sort of insights you can get. So with me today is Joanna.
Thanks, Matt. So my name is Joanna Pogowetsky, and I'm also a Premier Field Engineer with Microsoft. So I've been with the company for coming up to 3 years now. And in my previous life, I was a production DBA, like probably many of you. So put your hands up if you're a DBA. Cool, that's a lot of DBAs, awesome. So basically I've actually even worked with some of the people in this room in my previous life as a DBA, and now I have the honour of being a PFE, which is fantastic. It's a job that I really love. It's basically a job which allows me to go on site to customer sites and help you guys with your performance problems, with things like your risk assessments, delivering workshops, and delivering all sorts of chalk talks and information about the new features of SQL Server, any version really. So I'm specifically really excited about SQL Server 2016. In my opinion, it's a real game changer for the SQL Server DBA world. Anybody else with me on that? Not yet? I'll convince you by the end of this session, don't worry. So basically, our focus for today is going to be on two key features, okay? So we're going to be talking about Query Store. Has anybody heard about Query Store yet? Yeah, a couple of you. Okay, cool. So that's going to be one of our focus areas, and then we're also going to be talking about live query statistics as well, which is, both of these features are really targeted at those production DBAs. It's going to make your life so much easier when it comes to troubleshooting performance problems and things like that. Now, I just want to give a quick mention to the other features of SQL Server 2016, which I personally am really excited about. So we have things like StretchDB. So StretchDB basically allows you to stretch your warm and cold data to the cloud whilst keeping all of your hot data on-site on-prem with you. So that's going to basically have the advantage of allowing you to get better performance over your queries. And when you do actually want to run a query over your older data set, it will still go out and grab that data from the cloud. So, in your query execution plan, you just see a different operator remote query, which is pretty cool. So I'm really excited about StretchDB. Also excited about the features, the improvements that we've made to Always On. So 2016 Always On has a number of improvements. One specific improvement that I'm really excited about as well is, we've got the 3 synchronous replicas, and we've also got DTC support. Is anybody else excited about DTC support? I had a customer say to me earlier that they didn't actually know that that it didn't support DTC in 2014, and they basically went ahead and implemented Always On without realizing this fact. So apparently it said it somewhere in really small writing on NSDN. So anyway, so now it's supported, which is really cool. We have improvements to in-memory OLTP, so we've got less restrictions around in-memory OLTP. We've got temporal tables. Temporal tables are awesome. Basically, what they do is that they allow you to keep a historical record of what your table looked like at a particular point in time. So that allows you to do some discovery on your data and track analysis and things like that. So in my opinion, another really cool feature. And we've also got a lot of integration with advanced cloud analytics. So we've got things like integration with R. So we can now support stored procedures with R in them, which is pretty cool for the data scientists among us. We've also got things like Polybase, T-SQL via Polybase as well, which is going to be quite useful as well for those of us that are interested in that side of things. And yeah, so that's pretty much some of the features I'm really excited about. So what do you think about that, Matt?
No, we're all pretty excited about a lot of these features, and there's a couple of other ones, like there's other changes to the maintenance plans too.
Oh, yes.
So
thank you for reminding me. So the maintenance plans is one of the most exciting features. Well, it's the feature of the hour for me. So basically, anybody familiar with Ola's maintenance plans? Anybody? Yes, so some of you are using them. Okay, so now in your maintenance plan wizard, when you're creating your maintenance plans, if you do prefer to do them through the GUI, you can actually configure it so that you set a threshold to rebuild the index or defrag the index. So for example, by default, if it's 15% fragmented, then go ahead and rebuild. Or if it's 30% fragmented, then go ahead and re-index. And the other cool thing is that you can actually set the max DOP for a specific index rebuild. Did you guys know that? Don't know if that's been decided yet. But yeah, I personally think that's a really exciting feature. So thanks, Matt.
no, definitely those changes to the product certainly back up the investment that we know and we see internally, but certainly it shows everyone else the sort of investment that the product team are definitely making in 2016. And there's a lot of features that are either driven from what we've been working with out of the box, but largely also from what's now coming from Azure. We're running SQL in Azure in both IaaS and PaaS, and a lot of the features that we're actually now seeing in the box product are actually being driven down from that level too. So certainly there's a few things we just want to sort of touch on too before we jump into things deeper, but there's three main pillars, and this is to give you a bit more insight into how the product's involved. And the product team are really focused around three main pillars, and a lot of the features we've just discussed sort of cover the breadth of that. But today, what we're really going to look at is really the mission critical performance pillar, and even in that pillar alone, you can see there's a breadth of investment that the teams are making, improving existing features, adding new things. So it's really, what we're trying to drive home here is just that level of investment that the team's making to make sure that we all get the best out of SQL Server that we possibly want. And these are the reasons that we think it's pretty cool to be a DBA again. But today, what we're really going to focus on is just one key part of this whole feature set, and that's query data store. And along with that, live query stats. So while we start to look at that, just keep in mind that what we're spending the next hour sort of looking at is really just one of the key features that's being improved. And there's plenty of other sessions. We've got some other sessions to highlight at the end of this hour that we'll point out sort of that they're going to cover some of the other features for you. So if you haven't already seen some of those sessions or you're keen on learning a bit more, then they'll be able to dive into that feature set further.
Cool. Thanks, Matt. So, query store. All right, so Matt, you used to be a DBA, right?
Yeah, yep.
Cool, and did you ever have a performance problem as a DBA?
Well, almost daily, I think. So.
Yeah, daily, yeah. Pretty common scenario for a DBA. So did you ever have a performance problem because, say, an execution plan changed?
Well, here's the thing that I never really, knew at the time, or I sort of suspected it, but I could never get that evidence to really back up that that's what was happening.
Yeah, right. So, it's probably something that's likely to happen. Isn't always the easiest thing to trace or to track. Have you ever needed to identify which queries were performing slower than usual?
Oh, yeah, definitely, all the time. So.
Yeah, and don't you wish that you could just, grab a query execution plan when it was running really fast and then go, yep, that's the one that I want, go back to the good one?
Yeah, that's the ideal scenario, and anyone that's ever tried it, you know exactly how hard that is.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, to get that kind of information, you have to, trace through like your query profiler. You've got to go through your logs. If you've got MGW running, then you can get your data collector going to get some of that query information, query execution plans and things like that. But it takes a lot of time, right? So it takes a lot of effort as a DBA to do this kind of thing. So, it would be so awesome if we could just pinpoint the query that we're running that's slow, pinpoint when the execution plan has changed, And like these days to do that, just say you did, you were like, okay, I know which execution plan runs really well, and I want that one. I want that one, right? What would you have to do? You'd have to create something like a plan guide, right? Anybody ever created a plan guide? Like 2 people in the whole room. Okay, cool. And was that a good experience for you? No? Well, it wasn't really that much fun for me. So as, if you wanted to create a plan guide, it's a little bit of a pain, to be honest, because first thing you need to do your, show XML, you need to extract the start offset, the end offset, you need to fiddle around with it. It's very fiddly, it's quite cumbersome, and, to be honest, we have better things to be exploring with SQL Server than, having our heads buried deep in query plan guides. Not that much fun. So other things that we could be doing when we're troubleshooting is looking at the plan cache and seeing what's going on there, or maybe putting in some query hints. Does it need to change the max stop setting or an optimize for in our batch? So all sorts of things that we could be doing, but query store. So query store is going to help you a lot as a DBA because it's going to allow you to pinpoint queries that have regressed really quickly. Okay, so it also allows you to be quite proactive because it actually acts as a flight recorder for your database. So same way that pilots basically have a flight recorder box where they've got a history of everything that's happened, same sort of thing with query store. So all the queries that come through your database basically get recorded to your database once you've enabled it. So what it does is it's going to store a history of the execution plans for each query, and it's also going to help you identify recent query regressions. So it's going to allow you to force your plan minus the headache of having to force a plan guide. What do you think about that?
That sounds pretty good to me. Like those 2 people that have tried to do it before sound a little bit easier. Like click the button might work. So. That's
right. And just to give you guys a bit of context, so why do query plans change to begin with? Query plans can change because you might go from one version of SQL Server to another, okay, and it's choosing a different plan. Query plans can also change due to parameter sniffing as well. Or one example, just say, I have a little grocery store, and my grocery store has 2 products, milk and bread, okay? And then suddenly I've, expanding my product catalog, and I've got all these products, all these unique products coming through to that table. And I'm, rapidly expanding. So the selectivity of my data is increasing because obviously I've got new products in there. So there's a potential for the query to cross a specific boundary, which makes it choose a plan that's no longer optimal. So these are some of the scenarios that you can encounter for why query plans change. And one of the things that you can do now is you can actually do things like, just say you're about to embark on an upgrade to 2016. You can actually bring that workload into 2016 just before you've upgraded. Run some, just say run a distributed replay across your environment, and maybe get some information about which query plans are likely to regress, and then you can actually preempt that from happening by forcing that plan into play. Okay, so that's a pretty exciting feature in my opinion. Do you guys think so as well? Yes? Can see a few people nodding. Okay, good. So who wants to see a demo?
Yeah.
Do you want to see? Yeah? Okay, cool. I'll show you then. Okay, so query store, everybody can see my management studio, okay? Yep. All right, so basically it's pretty easy to enable. So you basically would just do an alter database set query store on, or you could just go from, it's by default off, so you would just enable it by setting it to true. And then in the properties of the query store, you've basically got a few options for your query store. So, you can basically specify the operation mode that it runs in. So if you do actually want that data to persist, so as in if you actually want all the query information or the query execution plan information to persist, then you want to be in read-write mode, okay? And then you can also specify a data flush interval as well, and that's going to be the frequency at which the query store data is flushed and persisted to disk, okay? So by default, it's every 15 minutes. And then you've also got your statistics collection interval as well. So that's going to be the granularity at which the runtime statistics get aggregated. Okay, so basically when you're looking at it in the chart, you can basically see the time intervals, and if you choose to go to 1 minute, then you'll basically see a time slice of 1 minute. Okay, you can also set a maximum size. And that's obviously something that you want to be thinking about. So, with Query Store, it still comes with a little bit of overhead. You still need to manage, its size and things like that. So, it's starting at 100 megabytes, but you can change that if you wanted to record more data. And then you've also got this query capture mode option as well. So by default, if you just were to leave the default settings of Query Store, that's going to capture all information, like all types of queries. But if you set it to auto, then you can actually discount the ad hoc queries, okay, which may be something that you'd want to do for your environment. Another thing you can do is enable size-based cleanup mode as well. And you can specify the stale query thresholds for the data that it's storing. And yeah, what do you guys think about that so far?
Pretty good.
And see down the bottom, okay, this is pretty cool too because you can actually see how much space the Query Store is taking up. So down the bottom here, my database in this instance is 269 megabytes, and I can see that Query Store available storage is 99, and the Query Store usage for my environment is just 1 megabyte at the moment because I don't have a lot going on there just yet. Okay, and then you can also purge query data if you wanted to as well. So if you were getting to like a place where you wanted a clean slate, then you can just purge that data and start afresh. Sorry?
Is that prompt for confirmation?
So the question was
yes,
if it prompts for confirmation there.
Yeah, it does prompt you for confirmation. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to jump into Visual Studio. And I'm just going to basically have this app run. It's just basically going to run in a loop. And what it's going to do is it's going to try and generate a place where the query boundary has to cross and create a new query execution plan as a result. So it's basically connecting to my instance, and it's just running it's going to clear the Query Store cache to start off with, and then it's just running this. Okay, so select top 10,000 from T1 with a random value for P1 and P2 in this query. Okay, and then every so often, when about 3% probability of us clearing the procedure cache altogether. Okay, so with a probability of around 2%, we'll clear the query cache.
So that sounds an awful lot like something I've heard called parameter sniffing during the execution. That's what we're trying to simulate here. That's a common problem. Has anyone hit that problem on production boxes before, right?
Yep, that's definitely a common problem that this is going to hopefully cross. So the real gem with Query Store is this. Okay, you've got some dashboards here, and this is where you can do your best work because you can, even in a proactive manner, you can just look into these views and have a look at what queries have recently regressed, as opposed to having a user call up and say, hey, like my query is running really slow all of a sudden. You can try and preempt that kind of thing by maybe automating through the DMVs, also DMVs, which we'll go through in a second. But maybe automating, when a query has regressed significantly, getting some alerts out there and things like that. So we're just going to have a look at, so we've got the regressed queries. So this is something that you would run in like a proactive kind of manner and see which queries have recently regressed. And then you've got the top resource consuming queries, okay? And what we're seeing here is we're seeing a histogram here of what's actually happened. So you can actually view these charts in a number of different ways. So at the moment, this histogram is showing me the total duration for that particular query. I'm just going to change that view to the number of plans, okay? On the right here, what I'm seeing is the different query plans that were generated. So I've got plan ID 1, which is doing like a RID lookup, and query plan 2, which is doing a table scan. Okay, and the cool thing about this is that if I've got this little icon up here saying compare the plans for the selected query in a separate window. Okay, and that gives me quite a nice view of what the operators are in my query and what's actually going on. And that might help me, or that might prompt me to then go ahead and do my usual tuning. But in the meantime, before I actually can get around to getting the change control in and all that kind of thing, I can say, yep, I like this. This is only taking me about 1 second to complete. So I'm just going to force that plan into play. And then it basically asks you, do you want to force that plan? And I just say yes. And then every single time that's going to be the query plan that runs. Okay, so
that sounds, an awful lot like, we're not having to play with XML now. Like, I don't need to go find the XML plan. I don't need to run a stored proc to actually force that in place.
exactly
It's just a
right.
click of a button.
Yeah, so what we've done is we've packaged it up for you and put a nice big bow on it. That's what we've done. Okay, so now for those of us who are more into our DMVs, we've got some DMVs, of course, so that's going to allow us visibility into what it's doing. You can get a lot of really granular information about your queries through this new DMV. So we're exposing a few more things about our queries. So for instance, we've got this query store query so if we have a look here, we've got a few some more interesting information like the average compilation time of my query and things like that. And then I've also got the ability to do things like query the last 10 queries executed on my database in the query store, or one of my favorites would be just this query, which is just doing a nice join with some of those DMVs, which is going to tell me queries that have regressed in performance in the last, say, hour, whatever you want, whatever time period you want to specify. So it'll actually give you a view of which queries have regressed in the past hour. So as I mentioned, that obviously gives you that opportunity to, perhaps look into automating some of that. Now, another really cool thing as well is we've got this, we've got this ability to force our query plan through a stored procedure as well. Okay, so that's really cool. And similarly, we can unforce it as well. So that's basically everything that we're supplying for you to be able to do through the GUI, we can also do through stored procedures.
So that sounds pretty impressive. So I'm quite familiar with querying DMVs already, but it sounds like these are far more granular. Did I pick up that right? There's other things there like compilation time and maybe some other bits of information that I can get out?
Yep, definitely. We're getting a lot more information that was previously exposed and visible to us.
Yeah, that sounds pretty impressive. So does anyone else think that, from the demo just seen there, what, potentially applying that into production environments now, or looking at within your own environment, like just getting that extra insight into query executions and, not having to go and run any other tools to sort of generate charts like that. You can actually just see it straight in the within the management studio straight away. It seems pretty easy to me. So before we sort of switch and look into live query stats, we thought we'd have a bit of fun too, just to make sure people are staying awake and not dozing off too much. And I know it's the afternoon session, people have just had some food and that, but people are probably thinking about the party tonight too, maybe. But I was browsing around on some social media a little while ago, and I happened to come across what I thought was a pretty funny joke, as far as the DBA goes. Certainly sums up sort of my Saturday night.
I've got one better than that, Matt. Sorry, but I think my one's better.
Oh, really? Oh. Yeah, I think that one does top my efforts, I think. And so I'm pleased to see that a lot of smirks around the room. So it's clear that people are definitely looking at the different database options out there. But we know relational's the way to go. So now let's take a look, and we're going to switch and look at live query stats. So now live query stats is really an extension of query store. So we can't really have live query stats without actually talking first about query store and the data there. Now, and before we sort of really dive into the detail of live query stats, what I wanted to talk about first is really what happens when people sort of report performance problems to us. And we established early on there that we're both Premier Field Engineers, and that means we're in the field working with a lot of customers. Like, there's plenty of people in this room that both of us have worked with in the past, and quite often we'll be helping you identify performance problems, or we might even be on site when a big performance issue pops up. And quite often I certainly witness a certain stigma around, and I remember it from when I was a DBA too, that you have someone in a business unit, so a non-technical sort of person that could be just a finance coordinator or someone out in the field just trying to run a report, and what they're trying to do is taking a little longer than normal. So they actually have to ring you up as a DBA and report that there's a performance issue. And quite often there can be, what I've sort of witnessed, there's this sort of stigma associated with that. And really it's at no fault of the DBAs, but it's really just we haven't had that sort of insight into the data to really let us sort of really help that person then and there about what that performance issue is that they're actually reporting to us. And that's what we sort of hope that you'll see from these tools that we're showing you, that you'll have that ability from there. But Joanna, have you witnessed any other sort of stigmas while you've been out in the field too?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I was flown down to Melbourne for the day a couple of weeks ago to help a customer with a very high-profile performance problem, and I got my profiler out and, you know, I was doing my monitoring and trying to see if I can figure out what the problem was, and all these queries are coming through, and I've got the manager kind of standing over me going, you know, so come on, what's the problem? You've been here for 5 minutes. What's the problem? And, you know, like obviously it's going to take us a little bit more time to sift through all of that information and really get down into the nitty-gritty of what the problem is.
Yeah, exactly. And that's that stigma that I'm talking about, is that quite often people, like, you know, almost don't want to ring up and report performance problems because of that sort of stereotype of, oh, they're not going to be able to help me or anything there. But really with these tools, you'll now be able to sort of dive directly to the problem. But, you know, traditionally as DBAs, and pretty much everyone, you know, the majority of the room are DBAs, so everyone should be pretty familiar with these sort of tools. But, you know, I can't sort of talk about live query stats without sort of, you know, talking about the history of where we sort of came from. And so we've had tools like Activity Monitor. So just out of the room, given that most of us are DBAs, like if someone was to report a performance issue, who would jump into Activity Monitor as one of those first sort of things that I'd dive into? I know I would, yeah, like a fair chunk of the room there. So in addition to that, we have things like Profiler or even extended events if you have made the jump and progressed to that. But, you know, certainly I've been working with the product for 14 years, so Profiler is one of my, you know, bread and butter tools as well. But, you know, as Joanna sort of spoke about, there's a lot of effort to actually collect that data. And then in addition to that, you have to actually analyze the data, and, you know, God forbid that you'd actually sit there and read every single entry out of the Profiler line by line, trying to figure out the sort of that trace of events that have happened. So even our own support teams have been faced with those problems, and that's where these other tools like SQL Nexus and even PAL for like Windows performance counters and that come from. But that's really been designed to sort of, you know, make it a little easier for the analysis phase of that data and to really give us nice reports. But it still means we have to go and collect the data. We then have to process it through this tool, and that all takes time. And really, at the end of the day, we just want to get to the problem, see what the problem is, get to the solution, and have it fixed for our like end users. So, and that's where, yeah, these tools, you know, at the end of the day, they're only really near real time. There's a lot of manual work involved, and they can be quite challenging to actually use. Like, particularly if we look at DMVs, and, you know, a clear case of that would be something like this DMV that, you know, I've got a couple of DMVs I'm actually using in this, but, you know, at the end of the day, someone has to write this query, and then you've got to actually understand what you're querying to get the data out. And then you actually hope that you can actually have that query readily available when the performance problem happens, so that you don't have to try to remember to write it off the top of your head. But, you know, something else, and I'm going to use these actually in the demo just to show you the difference, but, you know, there could be other things. And largely, some of the problem here is you need to really understand what that DMV is doing, because if you don't know, like, you know, execute query stats, like, it's just talking about what stats we have, you know, cached around the query. And if queries are being dropped out of cache or anything like that, it can really change the metrics that you're sort of seeing. So, you know, in addition to this, we've had vendors and partners, you know, sort of identify that gap in our own tool set. Like, we can't be naive in not talking about that. And they've really done a great job, you know, thanks to our partners, you know, for the work they've done, but at sort of implementing these sort of tools for us too. And, you know, these tools, I've been on site, I've used these tools too, and they do a really great job at getting to that sort of performance problem too. But out of the room, who here has like one of these tools, or even just one of the other sort of partner tools around, right? Yeah, like a large majority of you. So if you had your hand up, just put it back up for a moment. So out of that same group, who would have that tool running across your entire production suite? So there's like about 2% of that group now with their hands up. And that's one of the points. And now, a large reason for that can simply be the associated cost, because it's another tool that one of our partners provides, but it has associated licenses and extra costs associated, and that can be an actual roadblock to that customer sort of using those tools, which is no fault, and the partners do a great job with the tools, but they have to they've got to make revenue too. So, but this is what the product team have really tried to address too, and giving us as DBAs some extra tools that are readily available in the products for us, and that's where live query stats can really help out. So live query stats is all about, and as I said, this is built on top of sort of query data store, but this is really giving us the ability to look at a query's execution and see real-time metrics as that query is executing. So has that sunk in yet, what I just said? We're talking about looking at a query while it actually executes, not post-execution, which is really what we've had. So that's a big change for us. And we can see things like CPU memory and I/O, the sort of metrics that are bread and butter to us, and we've worked with them for a while. But really the idea here is that we will be able to rapidly get to identifying that performance bottleneck at real time while that query is executing. So there's a couple of things to know around live query stats just before we sort of look at it, but there's a few permissions that you do need. So we're talking about execution plans here. So you need to have the show plan permission. You also need view server state permission for your user. So if you are looking to look at the metrics, because we're talking about some system performance metrics too. The other thing to note is we need to have permissions to actually execute the query. So if you're going to try to run the query just in Management Studio, you need to be able to fully run that query. So that's another caveat. But there's a couple of things, this is the first sort of implementation of it, so there's a few things just to know that aren't quite yet supported. So if you're doing anything with column store, if the query runs column store indexes, they're out. If you're doing any in-memory optimized tables, you can't run live query stats on those. If you've got any CLR code, then that's also ruled out as well. But that's not to say that that won't come in the future. It's just right present stage, that's where they are. So. But we'll come back to sort of mention these a little bit after the demo as well, because there's a couple other caveats that I'll bring up during this demo. So I think I've spoken enough about it. Does everybody want to see a demo of it? Like, do you want to start to see the thing work?
We sure do, Matt.
So now I've got the just an Azure VM running here. It's just out of the gallery, so anyone could go and run this VM up. I've restored an AdventureWorks database because anytime we demo anything, it's on AdventureWorks. So within here, what I'm just going to show first is I'm just going to kick off a bit of a workload. I'm a huge fan of PowerShell, so I've written a few PowerShell scripts to just run some workload for me. And all I'm going to kick off here is a little bit of a workload. It's just going to run a couple of queries in the background. It's just randomly sort of running select statements and the likes against AdventureWorks. But to really understand what we're getting with live query stats, let's sort of look at some of these DMVs that you can run these on sort of any environment today. And this sort of one here is just going to give me basically current sort of expensive requests that are running. So really I'm looking at anything that's running in the exec requests. I'm currently just looking for anything that's greater than 50 as a session ID, so I'm ruling out any of the built-in sort of requests. Traditionally, if I was doing this on premise, I'd be looking for things that are running greater than 1 second, but this is a lab, so I just want to make sure I show everything. But when I run that sort of query, this is the standard sort of stuff that you can query and get today, and we get to know what sort of queries are running. We can see the database, the sorts of some metrics, so this sort of stuff, but this is what Query Data Store now does for you, like if you enable it on a database, but graphically, so you don't have to query it. But I could come along and, because I've managed to join onto a query plan there, I can actually get the the query plan that happens to be in cache for that query at the time, so I could get that sort of data and look at it. But what we really sort of wanted to look at then, other things I could do there, so maybe I want to look at the actual SQL statement that's running. So, if you've ever tried to query that out of an existing DMV, then you have to worry about the statement start and offset if it might be in a batch and sort of come up with the query text out of that. And it can be quite, troublesome. And as I said, like these sort of things, you need to be able to sort of run it at any stage, and you might be trying to, keep them in a USB key or something to run. But, quite often I know that, I've been using DMVs for a number of years, and I would often go, okay, well, it's all good and well to do that, but if I write one, I want to keep one, keep the query, and so I'd usually carry something like this around with me when I go on site. And people have gone to certain levels of querying. This is just running against DMVs, but doing things where we can actually query the data and then sort of rank by the different sort of CPU or I/O metrics and that sort of thing. So. And the reason I'm sort of raising this is the sort of stuff that Query Data Store now gives you, so you don't have to mess around with querying DMVs. But it really then highlights, even here, I can get the query plan out, but what we're going to look at is really what live query stats gives me. And so is my workload still running? That's the key question. So at the present stage it is. But just to make sure, I'm going to go and start another one to keep this keep a query running. So I've got at the moment a couple of long-running queries that are happening. So it could be that scenario that I was talking about before, where there's a report run, someone's rung up to report a performance problem. So if that happened to me today, I'd probably first thing I might start querying some of those DMVs. But if I was running 2016 right now, the first thing I would do is actually go to our good friend, the activity monitor. And so if I open that up right now here, so we get the usual things. Activity monitor hasn't been changed too much, but there's a new little tab there at the very bottom, which is showing active expensive queries. So rather than just being able to see sort of the recent expensive queries, so things that have completed, and then the stats are being captured for them. Now we can actually see the active expensive queries, and you'll see there's a couple that have been run here. If anyone's curious, they've just got to run for basically over a second to start to come up in this list. But if I identify sort of my active query, and it's pretty easy. This is a lab, so we only have a couple, but I can probably look at the one that's got the highest sort of elapsed time, or maybe the longest or the highest amount of CPU. And if I actually right-click on one of these, let's try one there. I can get things like looking at the query text, but there's another little sort of option there, which is the Show Live Execution Plan. So this is something new to us, and this is what live query stats is all about. So as I click into that view, just pay attention and just watch exactly what's going on there.
Wow, that is pretty cool. So you can see all the operators of the query just chugging along there, and you can see where it's taking up the most amount of time. And
yeah,
that is pretty. I wish I had that a couple of weeks ago.
Exactly. Like any time that someone would ring me now for a slow query, this would be where I'd sort of head to. And so yeah, if we follow an execution plan like we all should know how to do, but is you basically browse right to as far right as you can. I can go across there and you can see things like I won't zoom in at this point just because the metrics will sort of change, but all of these ones here have now hit about 99, 98%, but if I scroll up further, and I've probably actually picked the query that was started first, so yeah, it looks like that one's sort of running. So let's go find the one that was still in flight. There we go. So now we can actually see some of these other operators still chugging away. And we go and look, and we've got like the table spool there, and it's sitting around that 38 sort of percent. I'll zoom in it now, but it'll sort of freeze a bit. But you get sort of that percentage of actual sort of complete time. So you can actually quickly see where the workload is still happening in your query. So you're not having to look at the plan after execution, or the what's in cache, and sort of follow the thicker bars and look at the percentages, you can actually visibly see, and that's what the little running sort of ants, as we call them, or the little dots that are moving, sort of simulates. That's the data flow that's still in flight.
And you can see that percentage up in the top left-hand corner. What is that?
Yeah, so the other thing that we get to see here is that we've got this little 54% there, and eventually as I leave it, like it's on 55 now, that is the percentage of the aggregate of all of those operators, so the merge joins, the compute scalar and those sort of operators, all combined together to give you an overall percentage for that whole query. So as we sort of watch this, it's now up to 63%. So if I happen to be on the phone to someone and they said, oh, look, my query's running slow, and I fire this up, I can actually tell them and say, well, yeah, you 66% complete, so we can see it's churning away. You pass that sort of midpoint, so if you wait basically that extra bit of time, then you'll get to the point where the query's actually returns to you. But it gives you some indication that it's still churning away.
That's pretty cool. So in my previous life as a DBA, I used to do month-end processing, right? And it used to take a long time, and you never really knew when you could go home. Sometimes you could, you'd be going home like 2, 3 in the morning because you're waiting for stuff to finish. So I wish I had that about 5 years ago. Yeah,
exactly. It's certainly like out of the room, like who here could see use for this sort of feature straight away? Yeah, like pretty much the whole room just raised their hands. So, it's a clear evidence that this is something that, and this is why this is, out of all the features that we get with 2016, this is probably the one that I'm most excited about. And like, in the scheme of things, like it's probably, not even on the radar of some people, but yeah, it's one that I just see so much practical use for DBAs with it. Now, some things to know just around the the way that this query plan is sort of being displayed here. So I've actually managed to sort of delay long enough to actually get it to the point where I needed it at, which is to get it to this point where it says 98%. So from what, and remember we're working with a CTP release of the product at the moment, but in everything I've looked at, a live query plan will never actually get to 100% when you're looking at it. It basically hits about 98%, and then that's pretty much complete when you look at it. The reason for that is that the data that it's actually using to display this is stored in the background in a table for us, and we can access that through some new DMVs that we've been given. And I'll see if I can make scroll the right way. And the DMV that we're interested in there is the exec query profiles. So remember, we're talking about execution plans and sort of profiling queries. So it's this DMV that is going to give you the information of where that data that we're looking at in the nice graphical view is being pulled from. So if I actually query that table or that view right now, I won't have anything running. My query's gone and completed, but if I actually click back into the little window there, it still says that it's sitting at like 98%. So I'm just showing you that there is a little bit, at the moment anyway, a little bit of a lag between that live view to what's actually happening with the operators. Now, if I go and start my workload, I might just close a couple of these other little workloads down that are just doing random, just OLTP operations. Just to show that data a little bit more, I'll just start another one. So all that's happening here is I'm kicking off one query that's going to trigger this. And if we look at the data that actually gets saved at this point, once it actually starts to, I had a 15-second delay on actually starting the long-running query just so I could get some OLTP data. But so we actually get metrics here per operator, and there'll be one there for like the unique session ID. So if you know the session, so remember I'm only kicking off one query that's going to sort of be tracked this way. But we can see that we get the individual operators there. If I scroll in, zoom in, you might see them a bit better. The merge join, we can see there's a number of those happening. We also get the node ID to tell you whereabouts in the branch it's actually been made. So this data is what that live sort of query plan that we were looking at, that's what it's driven off. So, it's great. We can actually expose this data so you can, query it, track it, your own methods for like reporting or anything like that. We can also do things where, because it's a DMV, we can, join it onto the exec query plan like we would normally, and then that will give us information where we could actually then get the cached plan that's coming out. So in that case, when I click on the query plan link, I get the cached plan. I haven't personally been able to find a way that I can, from a T-SQL statement, get to that live query plan view. It's only off Activity Monitor for existing queries, but it's a good way to actually still join the dots between the data. What else is in there? So we still, we get all the metrics, and we can even go further than that, where we can do some sort of summary of that data, where you can actually then say, well, give me the operator name by the certain nodes, and pretty much do exactly what the live execution plan is doing, and actually summarize the data and get the percentage complete out of the end, so you can actually just query this text or this data and look at it in sort of grid results like you would, or capture the data for storage, or later reuse, I should say. Good segue. I was waiting for someone to ask that question. So the question was, what sort of performance overhead are we talking about? So, good. So sorry, I paused because I was worried that I was going to hit one of the open bugs. So we're talking about capturing extra metrics. So there's a couple of things to note about that question. So what we're talking about is capturing data like basically in flight. So there is a little bit of overhead now to basically capture that data and record it in the back end. Once that query has finished processing, that data is then dropped. So it no longer exists, which is why my live query plan sort of stopped at 98%, because the data had actually been dropped out of the view, so it couldn't refresh any further. The other thing to note there is that while this feature is new to 2016, the team have actually been working on it for quite a while. And along with Query Data Store, SQL Azure has actually had it running for a long while, if not years, in the background. And it's been turned on. It's just never been exposed to anyone. And the good news to us about that is that because it's been working away in our cloud offering that way, the team have actually refined that sort of collection down to as basically small as they can get it, so with the overhead that it's implementing. So that's a great thing for us, because it basically means that even with something like Query Data Store, we can enable these sort of features knowing that it's being run in databases for an extensive period of time already under extreme workloads and under actual workloads that, this is, when I say it's been turned on, it's been run under customer workloads and that. So the actual overhead becomes small enough that you won't notice it.
That was a really good question. So we're going to give out some prizes for people that ask really good questions. So would you prefer a t-shirt or a water bottle?
The other thing that I want to note about that sort of question too, because it's a good point that I was going to go into, I mentioned that I was only actually tracking the data with one query. So we actually have to turn this on before we'll start to actually see that live query stats data. If we don't actually turn it on, there was one of the queries when I clicked on Activity Monitor, it had the live query stats sort of option grayed out. So that was one that I hadn't enabled what we call the statistics profile infrastructure. And the way that we do that, if it's just from a standard query, we can run set statistics profile on or set statistics XML on. Both of those will enable this statistics profile capture. The other way is obviously the include actual execution plan. But if you are running a query out of Management Studio, there's a new little button just here which has been added, which is the one. It's basically the actual execution plan, but with the little arrow sign added to it. And that one will actually turn on sort of this capture. And if you turn that on and run the query, you'll jump straight into that live view. Ironically, that was how I found that this feature had been added. I noticed the new button and I went, oh, that looks interesting. So, so that's at a per sort of query basis that we have to enable it. So at that point there, like in answer to sort of that overhead, so at that point we can be very selective in which queries we want to actually enable this on. So, you know, it may not mean that every time someone rings you up and says, hey, I've got a slow running query, you know, can you help me out? How do we, can you look at it? So you do sort of have to think about turning it on before you can actually get to the data.
So can you turn it on for everything?
Yes. And this is the, so obviously we don't want to go sort of running set statistics profile on for every single query. That means like, you know, that's really a data provider. So in that stack sort of option. Now, you know, what we can do is extended events, because we all know that everything's like sort of, we're pushing towards extended events. So we can actually create an extended events session that's going to capture the execution plans for us. And when we do that, that actually enables this stats profile statistics data to be collected for us too. So I've got a statement here that's just going to create a very simple sort of session. The key event that you need to collect to enable this across multiple queries is this query post execution show plan. So that's the one that if you want to enable this on, you know, more than one query, that's the one that you enable at an extended events level. The other thing that I'm doing in this case is, again, I'm just sort of filtering out anything with a session ID less than 50, because I don't want to collect this on internal sort of sessions and that. The other thing I'd suggest doing if you were to do this on sort of a production environment is like that last filter line, which I'll go to, this and here, where, you know, I've got a little filter there that's going to say basically that the task execution time is greater than 1,000, so greater than 1 second. But, you know, ideally you'd adjust that within your own environment to meet your sort of needs. So what I'm saying is I would probably be looking to, you know, not capture this for all of those short running queries. You really only want it for that one or two that's going to run for an extreme amount of time. The other way that we can also capture the data, if you do any of the like query editing, if you do use the debug option in SQL Management Studio, like it's more for those query designers or, you know, developers sort of thing, we can also get the live query stats data that way. So it'll be captured and reported to us. So it means that, you know, as people are stepping through queries, they can also see where the bottlenecks are. So it makes sense to expose that to those sort of people that are writing them. But what I'll do is I'll actually create this extended event because there's something interesting that I want to point out to everybody. And so I've created the session there. If you're not familiar with extended events, we go into the management section down to sessions, and you can see my live query stats capture that's I've enabled. So you can also create it through the GUI, but as long as you've got that query post execution show plan event captured, doesn't matter which session you capture it in, as long as that's captured, you'll get the data. Now, if I start that session, I'm going to let that run. So at that point there, I've set the session to, you know, to start being captured across the board. And remember, I haven't put an execution sort of total time filter on this. It's just going to give me everything. So what I'll do is I'll leave that workload running. I'm now going to just kick off another workload that's similar again. It's just going to simulate a, I think I called that, yeah. So it's basically just going to go kick off a whole lot of random OLTP queries. And again, these are just standard, but they're just going to run against the instance. And the idea here is I should actually get some small queries that, you know, would otherwise probably not be of interest in this case, but some small queries running against the instance, and we should start to see them show up in this active expensive queries view. Actually, if I use the live zoom, we should see them pop up. So we start to see, that's my long-running one, so I still kick that off just to give me some extra workload there, but you can start to see some pop into this view. So we start to see these popping in. So this is where you know, maybe you've added this extended event there to capture this across multiple queries. You've added some extra filters so that you're not doing it on everything, but you're getting the sort of queries that you'd be interested to know. You can then look at the active expensive queries and go, oh, okay, well, that's interesting that, you know, I can then click on one of these and go show live execution plan. So I haven't had to change the query text at this point, and I'll just jump out of the view. Oops. Actually, so that you can sort of see it at a bit better view. But so that's gone into an update statement. As I said, this is a random sort of thing. I'm going to try to, oh, there you go, it is working. So one thing you might notice what's happening there is that the actual execution plan that we're looking at keeps changing. So it may or may not do that for me. This is where, you know, I did pray to the demo gods, but you'll see the, but if I pick another window, so all I'm looking at here, oh, there you go, it just did. As that percentage gets higher, once it hits about 98, we should see it change. There we go. So what's happening here, and this is to give you an insight into how both the graphical views works and the data that's being stored. So I showed that DMV where the data is actually being stored, and all that we're looking is querying that data for this view. Now, as one of my sessions finishes running, so let's say it's session 61, and that query completes, the next query so that session basically terminates. The next query that I kick off randomly picks up session ID 61. So this view then starts showing me the execution plan of session ID 61. So I'm just seeing all the random different sessions popping in, and all that this is doing is querying that DMV behind the scenes. So if I go back to that DMV, I can actually show you the raw data. Oops. And you know, in this list, if I scroll through, you'll see a bunch of different session IDs, 56, 68, and you know, as it generates the data, that list will keep changing. But really, I saw, when I first sort of saw that flicking of the execution plan, I actually stepped back from the PC and I went, oh, hang on, did I just imagine that happen? Like, what was going on? So, but it was only through understanding that it's pulling the data out of this table. As that session, like the data's not persistent then, so as that session completes, the data that we're storing about it for the live query stats is gone. So at that point there, that's where something like query data store then becomes your friend to get the actual execution plans out for those sort of queries that have executed in the past. So the question is that if we've got, we haven't turned on extended events, we haven't run set statistics IO, like that's not in the query text, and the query has already started, and that basically you've identified it's a long-running query. Unfortunately, I haven't personally found a way to turn it on, and I don't believe it is possible in the infrastructure as is right now. Like that's, you know, we're still looking at a CTP release here, but at present that's the case. So because it is something you need to enable before that query starts, because it needs to actually start tracking the data.
But if you've had query store enabled, then you can just obviously go back into your query store and then check there to have a look at it there. Yeah, good question. Would you like a water bottle or a t-shirt?
Okay. And it is. And sorry?
In which SQL edition is it available?
Yeah, good question. I'll park that one until I get to the slide for it. But it's, yeah, like the question around, you know, enabling it afterwards, like that's where I'd use something like Query Store, look at the data that's being collected, identify a filter that's going to sort of capture that from then on, and then you could maybe have a look at it in flight next time it sort of happens or that. There's another question?
Going back a little bit, with the IO statistics that you were talking about as well.
Yep.
So you may have different drives and have different IOPS, etc. And you may have a certain database set up with its log, its database file, and its MDB, let's say, being on the same drive.
Yep.
So do you get any extended metrics to do with that in regards to your IO modeling?
Yeah. So I'll repeat the question it was a bit, so let me know if I don't get it quite right. But the question is that, we get I/O metrics out with these sort of collections, and I'll talk about like query data store, and I'll include that there. And obviously as DBAs, we know that, ideally we get databases with the separated data and log and that, but sometimes we have databases that are configured where they're stored on different lungs or, different storage than what would be ideal. And the question was really, do we get any further insight through these metrics to help us understand that sort of difference? Yeah, so not really. Like, there's nothing really to sort of highlight here and say that it's running off a different sort of storage there. But what you would see is the fact that there's the extra reports and that you can get through Query Data Store that Joanna's just brought up that will give you sort of that information around the I/O performance. And that should, if you had a configuration like that, it should certainly be highlighted here when you compare, like, because the data that we're looking at here for Query Data Store is at a database level too. So it's per database. So if you've got one database that's configured, incorrectly or against your best practice of storage, then it should show higher I/O or less ideal I/O metrics than what you'd be expecting.
And you can also get more granular information from the DMVs on the IOs as well. So the DMVs are quite feature rich in that regard.
All right, so we'll to get back to the other question, we'll go back into finishing up with the slides, and then we'll allow for there'll be time for any other questions if people have them. But to sort of close off with live query stats. So the SQL Server version support. So here's the good news. While we're talking purely today around SQL Server 2016, if you have 2014 with SP1 or any of the updates after that, you actually have live query stats available to you. So,
which edition? Standard? Enterprise?
Good question. I haven't checked. Because I've been, and the reason for that is I've been mainly focusing on the 2016 release, which they haven't really sort of fixed that down yet. So,
Okay.
Thank you. He can have a prize too. So the answer to the question was which edition in 2014 is it available? And the answer is that it's there in standard. So if someone was quick on the search there to pick it up, so that's good.
Would you like a water bottle or a t-shirt? Water bottle.
The other thing.
What would you like? Water bottle?
Yeah.
Water bottle? All right.
The other thing to note there is that you also have this available, as I mentioned, I've been sort of test bedding a lot of these features in Azure SQL, and you can actually get live query stats out through Azure SQL as it stands right now. I haven't personally been able to get a live execution plan to display to me. It always seems to, once it's sort of the query plan completes, it'll display. I just haven't had the right sort of workload, I think, to really sort of test that out thoroughly, but you can always query the data. I've shown you where the DMVs are, so you can query that data in flight, because as you've learnt, the actual graphical view is just pulling off that DMV data. So, a couple of other things to sort of know there. I'd definitely suggest the latest Management Studio to look at there. So, the other couple of things just around live query stats. So, that was my little caveat that, the world is changing, so things will change rapidly. But, so we spoke about the requirements before. So just to sort of rehash on that, so you need to have show plan permissions. You need to be able to see the view server state permissions. There's no current support for column store, in-memory, or CLR queries. So no current support, I say. And you need to enable that statistics profile infrastructure. So we're talking about running set statistics IO, or set statistics XML, or set statistics profile on when you actually run the query, or you can click the button in the UI, but you need to either edit the query to turn that on, or if you do want to enable it at a more broad level like I did before, we can turn the extended events session on to track that event there for us, and that will then give you access to the data. So the last couple of things to sort of note, and we spoke about it, is that overhead. Yes, there is a little bit of overhead. My personal opinion is that you shouldn't really even worry about it. But certainly I wouldn't be turning on sort of the extended events thing for every single query. But that is more for the fact that if the query is executing in under a second, I'm probably not going to really care about looking at it in flight anyway. I'll just look at the cached plan for that. So, yeah, we've shown the DMV. So a lot of these are really just, the slides are there because some people might just download the slides. So I wanted to include the data there that I knew I was going to talk about, but just in case. At that point there, we can sort of open the floor to any additional questions that people might have. If you don't feel like answering questions right now, we'll certainly be hanging around, or you can find us a little later. We've got some extra like other sessions we'll recommend, or we'll be at the data den and that sort of thing. So there was a question. Yes?
Are we storing everything when we see the live execution plan behind the scene in some table or something?
I think the question was, are we storing?
Are we storing all the information about the live execution plan
Yep.
behind the scene in some sort of table or something?
Well, yeah, so the question was, are we storing any of the live execution plan like behind the scenes in that table? So we store it, we can access it through that DMV. It's not persisted anywhere. So
Unless you have query store enabled.
Can we play it back later on?
no, so the idea there would be that you'd run query data store and then as well, and that will give you that sort of query plan that was cached. There's no way to sort of then go replay this query. If you want to do that, I would be grabbing the query text and sort of running it in the test environment and looking at the live execution plan there. But yeah, try to remember who was first. Yep.
How long is it going to be before we get SQL to tell us there's a problem with the query store username? So we've got all these tools in place. We've got all the stuff there, right? So now it's a case of, I don't want to use that anymore.
Yeah, so the question is, how long before SQL Server starts proactively telling us that there's a problem before someone rings us to tell us there's a problem? Yeah, without even looking. Look, so that's where I put my other hat on, because I also deal with SCOM and monitoring, and that's where I guess that's our sort of answer to that, is that we're exposing extra data now that we can then monitor more proactively through another alerting tool, and then sort of acknowledge it that way.
There's obviously all different KPIs that we all use.
Yeah. So, sorry, the other question. Yep.
Yeah, do you know whether they've done anything to the management studio to do with Harbour?
No, I don't.
So what was the question?
Yeah.
Do you know whether they've done anything in SQL management studio to do with Harbour? You know what I mean?
R?
Arbar.
Row by economically growth?
No, I'm not sure.
No. We can probably take that question
take that
offline and
offline,
talk to. There might be some of the other MVPs or the other guys that are here that may have actually had exposure to that. So we can certainly probably tee you up with others that might be able to answer, or I can take it offline and sort of chase up some answers to see if there is anything.
Yeah, we can take one more question. Yep. Yep, that's a great question. So the question was, does query store work with always on? So the answer to that is basically everything that's persisted in your database on the primary will get replicated over to your secondaries, but it's only going to be information about that primary replica. It's not going to be information about how the secondary readables are being used. Cool.
So yeah, if there's other questions, we'll be hanging around. We'll just sort of wrap up now. So, but definitely, yeah.
Okay, guys. So before you all leave, I've got a couple of important things to say. So what we really want you to take away from this session is to go back to your hotel rooms and download SQL 2016. Okay, get cracking and play with all these features that we've shown you. Make sure that you do bear in mind that there are two release streams. So there's the release stream of the database engine and then the management studio. So you'll be prompted to download the latest management studio if you don't have it. And of course, be vocal, talk to other people in the community, ask us questions. We'll be at the Data Den all week. So if you have any questions or comments about our session, really appreciate if you come up and tell us what you thought. Also, another thing that would be great is if you do remember to fill out your evals. Okay, so we'd be really appreciative if you do and give us good reviews, hopefully, if you've enjoyed the session. And yeah, the hashtag, if anybody's into Twitter, we're both on Twitter, and the hashtag for this session is DAT335. Okay, so feel free to tweet us something positive, hopefully. And if you wanted to speak to the SQL Server product group, if you wanted to give some feedback, they actually do actively monitor the Twitter feed, right, Matt?
Yeah. We've both got colleagues that work in the product team, and we know that they actually read these Twitter feeds. So, in this changing world of like rapid cadence between products, and this is sort of across the board too, not just SQL, but the teams are looking to engage more and more with how the products are used by customers. So now is the greatest time. If you ever wanted to drive change in the product, now's the time to start doing that. So you can do it through the Connect site, is obviously the official sort of channel for logging sort of feature requests or like bugs that you might be finding with the latest release. But definitely even just at social media, like the teams are watching it. So it's a direct link into that product group.
Yeah, and then of course this is our contact information. So Matt has a blog as well, and we've both got Twitter accounts, and those are our email addresses as well. So feel free to contact us. And these are some of our session picks as well going forward. So some of our favourites for sessions for the rest of the day and for tomorrow. Alrighty, well, thanks so much for joining us. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you've learnt a lot. And please don't forget to fill out your evaluations and come speak to us, and have a fantastic night tonight.